Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you're viewing from. Um, my name is Scott Moskol. I'm here with my partner, Katrina Skinner, as we continue on in our look at issues involving cannabis in the financial industry and financial institutions. Kind of continuing on from our theme that we had last time, I think about 2 weeks ago, about how important automation is to the financial industries that are looking to get involved in this industry, meaning the cannabis industry. We're really happy that we have as our guest today, Steve Kemmerling, who is the CEO and founder and owner of CRB Monitor, which is involved with empowering financial institutions and capital providers to understand, identify, and manage cannabis-related rights and opportunities through its database of CRBs, or cannabis-related businesses, which will use that abbreviation, benefit, and their beneficial owners. Steve founded the CRB Monitor in 2014, and he has been a thought leader, subject matter expert, and data hound focused on addressing significant challenges around cannabis and banking. He created and continues to refine many of the terms, taxonomy, and frameworks relied upon by financial institutions and regulators as they seek to understand the cannabis industry and formulate relevant and effective policies, procedures, and standards. So Steve, our data hound, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Just to let folks know, we're gonna kind of dive in a second. We'll try to get to questions at the end. This is a micro webinar, so 15 to 20 minutes. And then if we can get to questions, we will. If not, please email them to us and we'll make sure that you get a reply, whether it's to myself, Katrina, or Steve. So let me just sort of jump in, Steve, and ask you, what is CRB Monitor? How and why did you start it? I guess in 2014, and just kind of who utilizes it? And I guess it's like 3 or 4 questions. So, but
yeah,
start from the beginning.
I've been doing the elevator pitch for a while now, but so I can answer it. But thanks for having me, Scott and Katrina. So historically, I was not dissimilar, I think, from you, Scott. I was historically in corporate investment banking, specifically mergers and acquisitions, throughout the majority of my career. Also spent a hot minute in institutional commercial real estate sales. So basically back in 2013, 2014, I personally was looking for a centralized source of information on, I'm going to use the word marijuana-related businesses back then, but cannabis-related businesses, what have you. And there wasn't, and still isn't, other than CRB Monitor, I think, what I would call a sector-specific corporate intelligence database, which is basically a fancy way of saying a database of all of the cannabis-related businesses. There are various business intelligence data vendors, which gets to the minutia of price per unit or consumer behavior. But really, as an investment banker, I was a heavy user of a bank-specific database where all it was bank information, assets, locations. I basically wanted to build the same thing and have built the same thing for cannabis companies. So it was a pretty broad use case. Was if I was an M&A, merger and acquisitions investment banker, and I want to go do 30,000 M&A roll-ups, you need a database to do that. But at the time, and still to this day, one of the biggest pain points for the industry and banking as well is this intersection of banking. And I'm going to use that word to mean depository institutions, so credit unions, banks, et cetera. The intersection of banking and the marijuana industry, right? So back when I was starting the company, FinCEN had come out with their BSA guidance on marijuana banking in February 2014. And among other things, it said, use publicly available information to understand the nature of the business. I would interpret that to mean medical versus recreational, cultivation versus dispensary, understand who owns and manages these businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of the primary use case I've been focused on. So we identify and aggregate information on currently about 40,000 direct, or what I call tier 1 and at this point, I'm going to use the word marijuana-related businesses. We haven't yet delved into hemp, but we
So
will
with, so
shortly.
with, so with tier one, you mean plant touching, right? Just
Plant touching, direct, and this is, so that's part of the challenge of this industry is what do you mean? So in 2016, I wrote a white paper that I think is fairly widely used and referenced, knowingly or not, where I defined a tier one, tier two, and tier three marijuana-related business, which was a bit more of a detailed version of direct versus indirect that FinCEN loosely refers to. And I felt well positioned to write that because I literally, we're creating a database. We have to draw a line of what businesses are we including, what are we not including, how do you identify them, how do you categorize them? Mm-hmm. So that was so these are very high level answers, and I will get more detailed, but I know we only.
Well, no. So what I'm curious about is, and I know that your database has applications both for the FI side or the financial institution side, but
Correct.
Also because as you mentioned, I do come from a banking corporate M&A world, but also on the corporate sort of capital provider side.
Right.
And just kind of curious if you want to talk a little bit about how different those two needs are, and maybe even how similar they are in the long run.
Yeah, great point. So when I started it really was from, I'm going to use the word investment banking, meaning M&A, capital raising, et cetera. But what I found in 2014 was arguably the database was too early from that use case because most institutional investors, private equity funds, and this is still true today, the vast majority of them still don't touch cannabis. Right. Obviously that's changed quite a bit, on a relative basis, but still out of the entire industry, the financial services industry, most banks, most institutional investors still don't touch the space. So that kind of left me, that was the original perspective, but that's how I kind of stumbled into bank compliance, if you will. Mm-hmm. So, and I will round back to the answer. So my original hypothesis was I'm an investment banker. I want to do capital raising, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, that use case still isn't all that true today. That is developing, and we have expanded to cover publicly traded cannabis companies of all tiers globally. But generally, the overall appetite for that is still quite small compared to the overall institutional investor market. So that's where I kind of did my first pivot into, well, how can we use this data to help financial institutions, depository institutions, identify, manage, and monitor cannabis-related relationships? So that's what we've been really focused on for the past 5 years, really, since I started, saying if you're a bank that wants to bank MRBs, again, here's a public, unbiased, third-party database that aggregates all this information, centralizes it in one place. So it gives you, a snapshot picture. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's, I think, the best thing of an owner has this many touch points to this many businesses in these different states with these different licenses. The only way to do that is to aggregate all that information into one relational database. That being said, we are starting to get the original hypothesis of investment bankers coming to me who want to look beyond just the top 50 publicly traded and look at the other 39,500 right businesses, saying, oh, there's a massive opportunity here. So non-bank lenders, private investors, et cetera, who are looking to understand the marketplace, which anyone can do what I did. It's just a pain in the butt, right? To take all that information and put it in one place. So I mean, it is evolving.
What's good for you is because I think almost all cannabis applications are generally either online or FOIA. You can get through a FOIA request, but it's public data because you're applying to a government.
Right. It's to varying degrees, so we won't bore the audience with, but it's public record, but every state treats it differently. Some are more, Delaware is different than Massachusetts, is different than California. So the breadth and depth of information varies pretty widely, but it's online, it's offline, it's websites, it's PDFs, it's databases, it's FOIAs. So it's really using every kind of trick in the hat to try to aggregate this information.
And, oh, I'm sorry, Katrina, were you going to say something, or did I interrupt? Okay, never mind.
Yeah.
So what I was going to say is, and I know you and I were talking about this, but it seems it's interesting that your database has as much application for FIs that are banking cannabis for tier one plant touching companies or even tier two ancillary, as well as those who don't or have zero tolerance policy.
Right. Assuming, and you and I were just chatting about this before the start of the call, and it's important for financial institutions to have their definitions correct. As we were, I won't get into the detail, but as you and I and others on this call have probably experienced, having bank accounts closed down and you're like, hey, I'm just an attorney, or hey, I'm a data vendor that helps banks manage marijuana risk. What are you doing? But it is true. We have, I believe, again, the most comprehensive database of unique entities and many beneficial owners. So a portion of my clients use the database to identify unknown marijuana-related relationships, because the not so unknown secret is MRBs or CRBs will do what they need to do to get a bank account. And I'm kind of saying that lightly, and I can appreciate that. But for those institutions who have a quote-unquote strict, and I'll use the word strict, no direct marijuana policy, to be clear. If you're an MRB, either applying directly or even worse, creating a shell company, holding company to avoid detection or using personal accounts, I don't want to be too strong-willed, and you're an attorney, but that's not. It doesn't look good. How about that? I'll say it doesn't look good. I get why it happens. I totally get it, but there are banks, believe it or not, I think you would, Scott, there are banks in Massachusetts. I'm told there's 5 or 6 in Massachusetts competing for marijuana deposits. In Colorado, there are 10 or 12. So it's state by state, it does fluctuate widely, but there are many more banks now knowingly, openly serving MRBs, marijuana-related businesses, and many, even more, serving hemp and CBD. But that doesn't change the fact that some MRBs don't feel like paying fees, really don't want to turn over beneficial ownership information, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think that goes away even with a Safe Banking Act passing, for example.
No, I agree. I mean, frankly, under FinCEN's beneficial owner rules, if it's an LLC or an entity and they're going to open up a bank account, they need to know if who owns if you own 25% or more, you have to reveal who those owners are. And it has nothing to do with cannabis.
Right. I don't think the cannabis industry, and that, to that point, that is, we'll say, relatively new. The beneficial ownership rules and enforcement is relatively new, but cannabis owners, especially call it legacy cannabis owners, don't get it and don't care, so, and it's a work in process, but that is, beneficial ownership is a whole major thing outside of cannabis as well.
Right. But even in cannabis, so we represent, Katrina and myself, we represent many MRBs, and, oftentimes when they're looking to open up a bank account, they have to disclose, all this information, and they start complaining to us, why do we have to do that? Why do we have to do that? And I think one thing, and because, obviously it's more from the investor side, right? A lot of investors don't necessarily want their name linked with cannabis for whatever reason, job purposes, reputational. But, what I tell our clients, I think Katrina, you probably do as well, and certainly with your previous employer at Safe Harbor, is that most every application requires you to list the shareholders or the equity holders. And you shouldn't have an expectation that if you're going to invest in a cannabis company, that you won't have to disclose somewhere down the line your name, right? It just happens because the state requires it. And then, the banks or other, like insurance, may require it.
Right. Yeah, and to that point, and you and I have had this discussion offline, it seems like the MRBs are willing to put that information in their application documents, which is public record, but then have heartburn when they give it to banks, which is, if a bank were to give that information over, that would be illegal, arguably. The banks can't just, but again, I get it. Like, I can appreciate some paranoia around the industry.
But banks have confidentiality requirements, right?
Privacy laws,
right? Whereas anything you submit to the state can be found out through a FOIA request, right? So
again, depending on the state, I mean, a lot of states consider that PII will, you know, even if they have public records rules, but I won't get into the intricacies of public records requests, which I now know a lot more about than I did 5 years ago.
So Steve, I'm curious if there's financial institutions who are listening to this today, how is it that CRB Monitor would work for them, or in what ways would you suggest it being used as a tool? As an example, is it used in addition to maybe their BSA software, or is it in conjunction with? Just kind of tell us how that would work logistically.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. So it's designed to be complementary to what banks are already doing. So to use an overly generic word, if you're a cannabis-friendly bank who's knowingly setting up a cannabis banking program, my somewhat biased opinion is the first thing you should do before you bother, this is my opinion, the first thing you should do before you bother to set up a program and invest in cannabis banking compliance monitoring workflow software is, do you already have these accounts in the first place? Meaning it's kind of ring fencing, what do you have? And usually all my clients offer those unknown marijuana related accounts amnesty, saying, hey, you know what, maybe you didn't know, but we're starting a marijuana program so you don't have to hide in the shadows. And it actually is a business development tool in one sense. So step one is understanding, you know, what is your risk tolerance to certain segments of the cannabis market? You know, if you're yes to MRBs or hemp or CBD, but the first step, in my opinion, is always, do you already have exposure that you don't know about? So that's true for any bank, not just marijuana friendly banks or non-friendly. But then after that, kind of after the initial screen and ongoing screening, because MRBs and or will continue to come under the radar. So continuing the screening is, they use my database as kind of, again, this unbiased third-party database that says, well, here's what CRB Monitor has about this business as it relates to the beneficial owners, as it relates to licenses, as it relates to licenses in other states. And that's kind of I'm the only place to do that. Because otherwise, it's a sanity check for what the CRBs themselves give the bank, right? They say, well, here's my beneficial owners. Well, how does that align to what CRB Monitor has? The bank should get way more information than I get from the public realm, right? But it's still a sanity check. And it also says, oh, well, I didn't know Steve also owned businesses in these other states. He didn't mention that. And I want to own the entire cannabis relationship, not just Massachusetts. I want to own Rhode Island and Connecticut and Massachusetts and Ohio. So it's a sanity check. Plus, kind of the last main key component is ongoing license monitoring and or supply chain license monitoring. So if I have, let's say I have a cultivation client, and we know that cultivation client is receiving revenue by selling marijuana to a dispensary. Do we know if have we verified the dispensary they're selling to is licensed, and vice versa? I mean, usually they are, but again, it's a sanity check. It's an unbiased sanity check. Or, hey, my license was just revoked. I'm a testing lab in Nevada. There's some negative news. Like I might not volunteer that information to my banker. So again, it's kind of putting all that information in one place as an unbiased source. So whether or not you're a marijuana friendly bank or not, screening your relationships to identify unknown relationships that's a common sense best practice outside of cannabis. Banks are already doing this. They already have the software. They already have the policies. It's just, hey, why wouldn't you apply it for marijuana? Plus, and there's a lot more utility if you are a cannabis friendly bank. You can use it as it's a CRM, right? It's every single business and a lot of their beneficial owners. So there's a lot of use cases.
Are you working with any of the cannabis regulators in any of the state? Because it seems to me that information, because most applications will ask, you know, certainly of the principals, what other licenses are you involved with, et cetera, and people sometimes don't necessarily include all that information.
Right, and that's not even a softball question, Scott. That's just insightful, because I'm literally having kind of two conversations like that now with the state regulators, saying, because everyone knows their silo really well, right? But beyond that particular state silo, it's hard to know what else is going on in other states. So I won't say which state, but the state where I previously lived, I had when I was starting the company, that came up saying, hey, I'm a regulator in this state, but I don't really know, besides if they tell me, honestly, what's going on in other states, right? Where I'm a Massachusetts regulator and they aren't supposed to be stacking licenses, right? But maybe they are through subsidiary companies up into one parent holding company. Again, this is also assuming the information is public record and that I've gotten it and that I've condensed all of it. But so kind of sort is the short answer.
But you are international as well, right? I mean, you have a database that covers Canada as well, correct?
In terms of direct plant touching marijuana businesses, we cover Canada and the United States at this point, is the short answer.
Okay. But the Canadian, especially with some of the Canadian parent companies, that's important for those financial institutions that are banking them as well.
Yeah, and again, I'm a data hound, as Scott said, I like that. Canada's pretty darn tight on their information that they publish, unless it's publicly traded, in which case we're looking at the securities filings, the CDR, the SEC filings to unravel ownership chains and subsidiaries, which is, I have some very, very, very large broker-dealer clearinghouse clients, because what I'm able to do is tie the publicly traded parent, not just saying, hey, this company says they have locations in these states or these countries, but we literally tie the publicly traded parent to those specific entities in those specific states. So you can say which states, medical, recreational, which provinces, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, again, that just gets to be the power of having a holistic database that looks across the board at all the relationships.
Great.
And you know, so we're talking about the past, kind of what you're doing in the present. You know, let's just turn to the future as we kind of, as usual, go over our time. But you know, as you mentioned, you know, I'm a corporate banking lawyer, and I kind of like to have you just talk a little bit about the possibilities and capabilities of all this data for investment bankers, for venture capitalists, et cetera, because, or even London, because it just seems like it's an untapped database with possibilities galore.
It's exciting, and you know, I went kicking and screaming like most investment bankers into the compliance realm, you know, but that's what's needed.
Bankers don't really like compliance,
so, right? But it's needed for transparency, you know, and again, it's a holistic database, and given where the market is, compliance, AML focused, and I'm going to get into the future part. You asked this question earlier, but good compliance is good business development, frankly. It gets to better underwriting, it gets to better risk management, it gets to better opportunity identification. So I get super jazzed, and I'm caffeinated really well. But it gets really exciting. When I look at this, I look at, you know, all of the you know, simplest commercial mortgages that there are REITs, there's one mortgage REIT, there's some private deals, but I mean, you're looking systemically at an undercapitalized, under-lent to industry. It's lending, underwriting, risk rating, you know, sorting the wheat from the chaff, mergers, M&A. It's almost so broad I get lost, but for me, the immediate use case is underwriting and lending, commercial, like vanilla commercial lending. It's, you know, not doing 20% interest rates and warrants. No offense to that deal. Like, if you can do it, get it while you can, while it's hot. But as banks are starting to compete now on pricing pressure just on deposits, the natural tendency, and this is kind of the present, is we haven't seen regulators. It is a myth to say regulators are clamping down on banks for banking marijuana. That's patently false. It's almost the opposite. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pass safe banking, but now that banks and regulators are getting comfortable with the first step, which is deposit accounts, right? Now we're looking at payments, and after payments, lending. I mean, that's what banks, that's how they make money. You know, other than your non-interest income, if you aren't lending, you're not a bank.
Right, and some banks in the industry are exploring, I call it indirect loans. So to the extent they're banking marijuana, if there's a landlord who has their mortgage with an institution that has zero tolerance, and there still are many of them, you know, there's an opportunity to finance out so they don't get actually pushed out of the bank. I think that's, you know, I think, and it's easier to underwrite commercial real estate than it is a partially sometimes cash flowing industry.
Right. I mean, we'll get there, but it goes checking, demand deposits, right? It's where we start. And then it's like, let's do vanilla commercial underwriting, and then equipment, and then maybe, then cash flow. It will all eventually occur. But I do think unless until marijuana itself is federally legalized under clear regulatory expectations, we will continue to have a dampened banking industry to the space relative to unequivocally legal industries, right? And I don't sound too negative when I say that, but it's even with safe banking, you'll still have, I personally believe, and I might be totally wrong, a significantly dampened appetite for most banks getting in the space. But banks, bank MSBs, adult entertainment, and all gambling and all sorts of other high risk stuff, they do it, and we're already seeing banks banking marijuana in certain states. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just say, but a lot of banks and certainly a lot of regulated, non-regulated lenders, they will stay away from like the sins, right? Tobacco. Right. I'm not saying these are sins, but that it's a term like tobacco, gambling, adult entertainment. And, I could easily see cannabis be put in that category, or at least maybe just adult use cannabis, certainly.
Yeah. So I mean, it's I'm so excited. I think for those of us who've been in the industry for 4 or 5 years, we're like, oh man, we're getting tapped out. But in reality, when I step back, I still think, to use a cliche, that I think we're in the second or third inning of the ball game. I still think there's, we're talking international, we're talking tier 2, hemp and CBD are still huge question marks. The industry as a whole, we have decades ahead of us. Hopefully we'll all be retired when all this stuff gets figured out, but it's massive.
Katrina, did you have?
No, I was just going to say we need to wrap it up so we can be cognizant of everybody's time. And so thank you, everyone.
Wait, there is one question. Let me just ask this quickly. It's for Steven. What would you say are the distinctive benefits of CRB Monitor as opposed to a data warehouse service like LexisNexis?
Yeah, good question. From my experience, even as an investment banker, of course, it's self-serving, right? But there's subject matter expertise. Mm-hmm. All we do all day long is think about identifying and building out profiles of marijuana-related businesses. So LexisNexis, the Dow Jones, Thomson Reuters, all great firms, right? Dun & Bradstreet, all great firms. But it's one of 300 products, data assets that they build. At least two of those have marijuana business lists. They're CSV files, and that's all you're going to get. You're going to get a CSV file. None of the license, none of the beneficial ownership, no user interface, no website, no source documents. It's, hey, here's a spreadsheet. They pat you on the back, which is fine for them. But for an investment banker, again, maybe it's okay for a call sheet, but I'm looking for more information and subject matter expertise and news and market concentration. Good question.
Almost in that you are so focused on this particular industry with respect to the data hounding, you can put the correct algorithms and search terms and whatnot. And I think that's probably the distinction with Lexis.
Yeah, and I'll be quiet here, but it's when I hear what the big guys are doing, like I'm again self-serving, but I think I'm the leader. So I started with definitions, and before no one else had a definition of an MRB. So it's like, how do you even know what's going in the list or what's not going in the list? And then I'm the only one who uses FOIAs for whatever reason. The big companies, their legal departments say we only include something that has a URL attached to it, like a news article, right, or a database. Well, if there's no URL, you're not including it. So then I started adding beneficial owners, and everyone said, why would you add beneficial owners? I'm like, why wouldn't you? And then people started adding beneficial owners, and I started adding licensing information. Then the big guys started adding licensing information. So it's
follow the leader.
I think so, but what I'm doing isn't the first time. Like there's industry specific databases and companies that focus on banking or energy and power or insurance. I'm doing that for cannabis, and that's what investment bankers use. So it's just different.
Great. Well, listen, I know we're definitely over time, but I want to thank you, Steven. This has been really awesome, really informative. On behalf of Burns and Levinson,
Yeah,
Katrina and
thank you.
myself, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.